Oh, hello. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Masao Suzuki. By day, I'm a professor of economics at a local community college. And by day and night, I'm also on the central committee of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, which asked me to be on the show today about the crisis in unemployment. So the first thing I want to note is that while there was a lot of news a few weeks ago about the layoffs and unemployment and red lines and stuff, it seems to have disappeared along with a lot of news about the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of it is good because there's been a lot of news about the uprisings and protests across the country in the wake of George Floyd's death. But a lot of it has also focused before that, and now you see it back more on this whole notion that we can reopen the economy and sort of ignore the pandemic, and then all the jobs will come back. So that's unfortunately really not the case. So anyway, where are we right now? The Labor Department just released the unemployment report for the month of May. Now, their unemployment report is based on surveys taken usually during the second week of the month. So in this case, it's the week of May 11th through 16th. They counted they reported 21 million people unemployed. But then in a note, and they have a long addendum actually, they basically admit they probably misclassified about 5 million people who said they were working, but they're not, they're employed, but they're not working at all. And typically those people would be, regarded as not employed, but they were miscategorized. And so we're looking at probably more like 26 million people then. But since then, in the last 2 weeks, about 4 million people have applied for the state unemployment insurance, and 2 million people have applied for the pandemic unemployment assistance program, bringing the total to about 32 million people. Now, this is just an estimate. There are, on one hand, not everybody who is still unemployed 3 weeks ago is still unemployed today. But on the other hand, there's millions of people who have applied for unemployment insurance because they lost their livelihood and have not gotten it yet. And there's also unknown number of people who have either applied for the federal pandemic unemployment assistance program, who have either not gotten it, and there's at least 4 states that haven't even opened up the program at all. They're sort of like, they're all with Republican governors. It's like, no, we're not going to do that. Sorry. So anyway, it's about 32 million people, which would mean there's actually about a 20% unemployment rate, about 1/3 higher than the official rate reported at 13.3%. Now, as has been historically true, the unemployment rate for oppressed nationalities have been higher than that of whites. The Latinos have had the highest unemployment rate, about 5% higher than whites, even in the official reports, and then followed by African Americans, and then Asian Americans. One of the things that's actually unusual about this recession is, in most recessions, the industries that get hit hardest are either construction and or manufacturing. Unemployment rate, the last recession that included a financial crisis, the housing industry was hit really hard. New home starts and all of the construction jobs that go along with them fell about 75% from the peak of the boom down to the bottom right after the financial crisis. And the construction industry is still overwhelmingly men. Manufacturing is often hard hit in the previous recession back in 2001. You did see a big loss of manufacturing jobs. And that's predominantly, although not as overwhelmingly as in construction, men. So typically what we see is the unemployment rate for men going up faster and ending up higher than that of women. So this is a untypical recession caused by the pandemic. And here we see women having a much higher unemployment rate. And so different groups that are already have an unequal status in society, oppressed nationalities and women, are suffering even more from the unemployment crisis. Now, one of the things about the unemployment report is they count anybody who says they're employed as working. And what there's a law. Oh, and you also have to, I'm sorry, in order to be officially unemployed, you also have to be, say that you're looking for work. And so the Labor Department does publish figures that are broader. They include people who say that they have looked for work, they want to work, they're not employed, they just didn't do it in the last month or in of the survey. And and they also count people who are working part-time that aren't working part-time because they want to, but working part-time because they can't find a full-time job because the economy is bad. And so these groups of people, which back in February were only 3.5% of the labor force, are now almost, or as of May, almost 8% of the labor force. And so there's a lot of people who are considered employed, or I should say, or for the part-time workers, or not considered unemployed, that are actually out of work. And these part-timers that can't find full-time work, it's a trend that started especially in the last couple of recessions, and it's going strong now. There was just an article in the last week about how Starbucks is going to be cutting, thousands of jobs, cutting the hours for thousands of their workers. And so a lot of corporations are going to be doing that and have been doing that, cutting their workers' time. So technically they're still working, they're still getting paid, but they are not being counted as unemployed. Now, maybe I'll interject is I see some questions that are relevant to this. So I see a question about permanent versus temporary job losses. And so what most firms have done originally is to call their layoffs temporary. And in a sense, they, in some cases, they knew they weren't be calling back people. In many cases, I imagine they thought they would be calling back people. But over time, and it's not a lot of time, it's a matter of weeks, more and more of these jobs have become permanent losses. So for example, there have been, especially restaurants who closed temporarily, but then as they figured out what it would take to reopen, they haven't, they basically shuttered down. A number of retail establishments have declared bankruptcy and closed, hundreds of stores permanently across the country. And so those notified their workers being laid off. And other retailers have decided to close hundreds of stores without even, without being bankrupt, but just cutting back. So there's more and more jobs that are being permanently lost. And part of, the question of how much, it's just going to, time will only tell. But the fact of the matter is there's, one of the things that is going on is that it's not just the US economy, it's most of the world economy has been hit really hard and is really suffering right now. And, a sign of that is US exports, goods and services that we sell to other countries, have really dropped dramatically. And given the situation in the rest of the world, that this is not probably going to change. So, for example, in April, when you look at year over year, the previous April exports, US exports were off 20%. And so there's a lot of business that isn't really coming back anytime soon, and that's going to translate into permanent job losses. But let's get back to the unemployment report. One of the things that's just starting to come out, and I'm glad to say that, as far as I know, I was the first one to write an article in Fight Back newspaper about it, although there is a major article in the Washington Post today about the problems with the unemployment insurance, the unemployment report, because the unemployment report said that unemployment actually went down between April and May. And to me, this just doesn't make sense, because if you look at the number or the rise, not in applications, but in the number of people who are on unemployment insurance. And so to be on unemployment insurance, they have to verify that you're actually not working. About 17 million more people were on unemployment insurance in the week that the May survey went out than in the week of the April survey. So it's really hard to jive or see how 17 million more people losing their jobs goes with the Labor Department report saying that I think they said about 2.5 million people regained their jobs. Looking at some of the other reports, there's a couple of, these are private surveys, but they're done for the month of May. They're what economists call or what they call themselves, a purchasing manager index. They survey purchasing managers in businesses, large, medium, and small, across the country. And the original one that people or economists often look at is the what's called the Institute for Supply Management, or the ISM. And they had two reports. They do a report on the manufacturing, and they do a report on services. And both of those reports were 50% is like the break even between firms hiring and firms laying off. Their indexes were in the low 30s, which is an indication that a lot of firms are laying off people and relatively few are hiring. Another private survey, the ADP, which is a manpower hiring group, estimated there are about 2.75 million jobs lost. So again, there's all these other surveys that really don't go along with the Labor Department's claim that the unemployment dropped. Let's see, maybe I want to go here. Now, one of the things that is of concern is many people have been able to get unemployment insurance because of the CARES Act. There's been additional supplemental uninsurance, and then also the pandemic unemployment assistance has been extended to people who lost hours and self-employed, which some states had covered before, but many states did not. And so this has been covered through the CARES Act, but those aspects of additional federal support are set to expire on July 31st. And so this is a big worry because the Republicans in the Senate are very opposed to Democrats' proposal. The House actually passed a bill called the HEROES Act, that would try to extend these measures and expand on these measures. And that is meeting strong opposition. And actually, the Senate is going to be recessing, so they probably won't even take up business till the beginning of July. And so it's very unlikely at this time that you'll see extension of these factors. And this has been a big factor, especially in April and May, because of the unemployment, because of the $1,200 that most individuals got. This helped really buffer the shock of the recession. But despite this aid, you still see a lot of people. You see, well, actually, you don't see it in the media, but it's still there. People lining up at food banks in their cars, often like a mile long. You see a growing number of people who are having problems paying their rent or mortgages, and a lot of them are getting by. Well, let me go back to where I'm looking at my notes. Every day I write notes about what's been going on in the economy. And so anyway, on Wednesday, a report came out. There's about 10% of all homeowners, or I should say home buyers, because we really are paying off the bank. We don't own it till we paid it off. So that would include myself. About 10%, almost 10% of home buyers are in some kind of forbearance or some kind of agreement with their lenders to delay their payments. Now, many of the people, one of the features of the CARES Act, it allows for people with federally backed mortgages to just tack on the payments on the end, but that only covers about half of all mortgages. So other types of forbearance, you're supposed to pay, months of mortgage payments off in 60 or 90 days or something like that. And if people have been unemployed, or even if they get their jobs back, right, how are they supposed to pay months and months of rent or mortgages? Same thing, a lot of places like my city have enacted an eviction ban, which is good, but technically tenants who can't pay their rent, they owe the whole balance and can be evicted once the ban is lifted. Auto loans, 3 million auto loans are behind, 15 million credit card payments are behind. So a lot of people who were on the edge, I mean, it was estimated 40 or almost half of working people were living paycheck to paycheck in the United States before the crisis. And so a lot of these people are being pushed over the edge, and many more will be pushed over come July 31st if there's no extension. Just one last thing, and maybe I'll get to some of the questions, is one of the things that's continuing, and even noted in the flawed Labor Department, is the continuing loss of government jobs, and especially at the state and local level. And so state and local governments in general have to balance their budgets, which means if their tax revenues go down, which they are going down, sales tax revenues have been going down, income tax revenues have been going down, then they have to either raise taxes or cut spending. And raising taxes in this kind of a recession is a very difficult thing to do. So what they've been doing is they've been cutting jobs. And so this is worrisome, not only because this is part of the reason the last expansion was so weak, was the continued loss of government jobs for years. It also tends to hit women and oppressed nationalities especially hard, who tend to be overrepresented in many of the government jobs, partly because many of them had anti-discrimination rules and regulations even earlier than the private sector. And it also means a loss of services, cutbacks in education and other services. So it's a very problematic thing. And again, this is something that there is that Democratic bill in Congress did propose more aid to local cities and states. And again, I think one of the Republican senators says that's going to happen over his dead body. So it's really not something that the Republicans want to do. Let me try and check out. I see more questions. I gotta just expand it because I'm not seeing the whole question. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. Should have adjusted this before. There we go. Now I can see the whole thing. Oh, so there's a question I see. Will there be an industry will there be a bubble bursting in any of the industries? And will things go back to normal? So this is really well, they're related, but two questions. So in terms of an industry bubble bursting, I think the biggest impact, which we're already seeing, and it's not a bubble, but we're seeing big losses in jobs. The second one is big losses in retail. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of permanent store closings, jobs that are not coming back. And there was already a trend towards more and more online shopping even before the recession. And so one of the things the recession is doing is speeding up a lot of processes that were already in the works beforehand, but they're just being sped up. And so I think there will be overall losses in jobs, especially in the retail sector. And what's really iffy is things in sort of the restaurant, entertainment, travel, and leisure industries. There's a question, and it's a common question of when will things get back to normal? And if normal means before the pandemic hit and the recession, well, there's two issues. One is there's a question of the pandemic. And I'm not an epidemiologist, and there are close to a dozen vaccines under development right now. And I certainly hope that we can break all kinds of records and maybe have one out. Someone will have one out by the beginning of the year. But the unfortunate truth is the world record for developing a vaccine is 4 years. So there's a lot of money. Yeah, I know it's not publicized a lot, but that's just a fact. So I think we can beat that. I have faith we can beat that because there's literally billions of dollars being poured into the element, and there's hundreds, if not thousands, of scientists and medical researchers do that. And there has been big advances. One of the Chinese companies developing a drug is now in the last phase. There's 3 phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 3 testing, which is widespread testing on humans. And of course, they have a problem that you really need a lot of people who might be exposed to the virus. And the problem, I mean, it's a good thing that in China, the number of new cases is like in the single digits, but it just means like, okay, we'll inoculate a few thousand people, and if nobody gets sick, well, that doesn't really mean as much. So evidently there's a news report that they've made an arrangement to do widespread testing in Canada, which hasn't been as hit as hard as the United States, but still it's not a situation where there's only a handful of people getting infected every day. So in that sense, I am hopeful that the pandemic will be overcome, but it won't be in a matter of weeks or even months, and hopefully by early next year. Because the other question is manufacturing millions of doses of drugs. And so that's going to be a big problem, especially in this country, where we've offshored a lot of the drug manufacturing that goes on. So we develop, US companies do develop a lot of drugs, often in other countries, but we don't have, we've been importing a lot of drugs. The other thing is, in terms of the economy, there's two things. One is the last recession, which had not totally unique, but a different sort of shock in the middle of it, which was the financial crisis. And while it's not the same as a pandemic, it is sort of an additional factor that, to me, makes it more likely that this recession will last longer than the typical recession, and any bounce back could be quite slow. And one of the reasons I already alluded to it or mentioned it before is the fact that this is affecting most of the world, right? So it's not like the rest of the world is going to be able to help out. And so we shall see about that. Let's see. Couple things in terms of more economic changes. It was mentioned here, well, what about the gig economy? How do you think the economy will change? Again, this was a tendency that was happening before. I think that it's something that is going to perhaps, unfortunately, continue to grow, because one of the things about working at home is, in my view, it makes it easier to sort of hire people on a short-term contract, case by case basis. So I expect that there will be an expansion, maybe, and not only the gig economy, but also big expansion, which was going on before, of part-time and temporary work. So I think all of those three will continue. And unfortunately, one of the things that does is it pushes people to the edge even before there's a recession. So the next time around, it will be problematic. Has there been a rise in unexpected industries during this period? I'm not aware of it, although, again, I'm an economics professor, not a business person. I think the ones that you expect to do better, the different industries, businesses that have, been able to sell a lot more because of the need to stay at home. Company, I'm not trying to advance any particular, I have no corporate backers. Zoom comes to mind, and in fact, I think I'm on a Zoom session right now. And before, I had to teach from home because I'm a college professor. I mean, before that happened, I didn't even know what Zoom is, but I had to have a crash course in this. One of the things that's interesting, and it'll be challenging, is some of the big internet giants like, say, Facebook, actually have had challenges because there's also been a big drop in advertising revenues. So even though there's more people than ever on Facebook and they're on there more often and for longer times, their ad revenues are way down. And so I'm not sure I expected that. So we'll see. And there's going to be a lot that I just need to learn. There's a couple of questions having to do with people in the US. What kind of attacks on the labor movement will we see as the economy opens up? I think we're already seeing attacks on workers in particular, because part of this whole reopening is an attempt to force workers to go back to work. And I know that there have been thousands of workers who have actually been cut off of unemployment because they've refused to go back to work, or even hesitated to go back to work. Because I know of one case in a news story where the workers wanted to meet with their management about safety conditions, and the management ended up just firing all of them, saying, sorry, it's not up for discussion. And so this, and fortunately, and then this goes hand in hand with the Trump naming meatpacking plants as necessary for wartime production. And this is, to me, a vast misuse of the War Powers Act, which of course should not be unexpected from President Trump. It's one thing to say, okay, you have to make ventilators. Well, okay, this is really needed for the pandemic, but it's another thing to say, no, you have to reopen meatpacking plants when in many counties across the U.S., the meatpacking plants have been centers for the COVID-19 outbreaks. And, the meatpacking conditions are actually very poor already, and now they become even more dangerous, not only for the workers, but for their families and the communities that they're in. And so I think this is not going to be good for the working class as a whole. I think a lot of the layoffs going on, especially in the government sector, will tend to weaken the union movement, which tends to be, there's higher percentage of workers in government jobs who are unionized than in the private sector. So this is going to, again, weaken the union movement. But I do think that doesn't mean the union movement is going to, or the labor movement more broadly, is going to sort of roll over and shrivel up, because there's been a lot of fightbacks against unsafe working conditions, against the pandemic. And I think, because I think this crisis will be ongoing, there'll be a growing struggle around unemployment. One of the things that, again, was attempted, but it was sort of shut down by the Republicans, was an attempt to expand food stamps. And that's something that is really needed because there's more and more people who are, just surviving off of food banks and things like that. And so I think there will be both attacks by the labor movement, but I also think that this is a big opportunity for the labor movement. There's an excellent question here about indigenous people. And so I can say two things. One is indigenous people have really been hit hard, both by the recession and by the pandemic. So in terms of the pandemic, one of the areas that has been unfortunately hardest hit has been the Navajo Nation in north, I'm trying to put the map in mind's eye, northeast Arizona, which have had, along with New York and a number of other places, some of the highest rates of the COVID-19. And in particular, the death rate has been high because people don't have, many of them lack even running water, electricity, of course, good medical care. And so they've been hit very, very hard. Now, one of the problems, and unfortunately, I'm sort of a data-driven person, is the federal government doesn't report much data on Native Americans when it comes to the economy or anything else. So for example, in the monthly unemployment reports, there's no data on Native Americans. The only real data that is available comes out every 10 years with the every 10-year census. And so there should be some information, more information, updated information coming out in 2 or 3 years about Native Americans. But when consistently when the census reports come out, you see that Native peoples are the worst off in almost every socioeconomic way you can look at. If you look at income, lowest income, least education, shortest lifespan, et cetera, et cetera. They're situation was already quite dire before the pandemic and the unemployment, the recession was hit. Now, one of the things that's happening, and unfortunately, I haven't been able to follow it as close as I can, that a number of Native American tribes have been trying to exert more of their sovereign powers to limit traffic and travel through them because of the COVID-19, which I think they have a perfect right to do, but they've been, that has of course been pushed back by, in particular, state governments and the courts. So that's going to be a ongoing struggle. There's a couple of questions I see about the international situation. So let me start with the second one. What happens to the imperialist powers, or you might say the advanced capitalist powers of United States, Europe, and Japan, based on what's happened with the worldwide recession? And here the situation has varied a little bit. The economies and the health of peoples in Europe and especially in Western Europe and in the United States have been hit very hard on both counts. I think economically, Europe has been, especially Western Europe, has had a little bit less of a shock because they have a much, generally, not in every country, a stronger safety net. And so there's been less economic pain than here in the United States. I think Japan, and I'll be honest, I don't understand all the reasons, has been hit less hard by the pandemic. Although they have been hit, but not as hard as the US and Western Europe. And in the same way, their economy has not been hit as hard. So in terms of vis-a-vis, though, other third world countries, it's a sort of changing situation because the pandemic, of course, the virus was spread through international travel. And just let me make it clear that while the epicenter of the epidemic was in China, and then it spread to Europe, and then it was here in the United States, it was brought in by Americans. Trump's so-called China travel ban just banned Chinese nationals from coming to the US, but it didn't ban Americans from coming in, which I'm not advocating, or didn't ban Americans coming back from Europe, because the biggest outbreak, for example, in New York seems to have been traced back to coming from Europe. So it's not surprising that we were hit hardest, but it's something that has been developing more slowly, but it's going to be hitting hard many of the third world countries. And unfortunately, because you have a very right-wing, a sort of Trump kind of guy, they're actually buddies. I think his name is Bolsonaro in Brazil. Brazil is now unfortunately, neck and neck with the United States. And in fact, I think may have surpassed the United States in the number of deaths per day. And so here you have, it's considered a middle income country, but because of the income inequality, there's a vast number of poor people in big urban areas that have been hit. It's getting hit more and more hard by the pandemic. And so while initially it may seem that the advanced capitalist countries were hit harder, it's not. It may be that it's just slower in the third world, but it could actually be worse in a number of countries. Now, there is a question about how China's economy has been affected. So the epicenter of the pandemic was in China, but the Chinese national leadership very quickly of course, there's complaints that they weren't quick enough, but hey, they did what they needed to do, and they basically locked down the city and then later the whole province, Wuhan city and Hubei province. So you're talking about 11 million people in Wuhan and 60 or 70 million people in Hubei. And then, blocked travel throughout the country and instituted more limited bans, restrictions on going out to eat and things like that throughout China. And so China has gone from being the epicenter in the country with the most cases. So, for example, early on in the pandemic, actually, China was #1 and South Korea was #2, and China had like 9 times as many cases as South Korea. And then everyone else was way behind. But they were able to, through old-fashioned quarantine, testing, and contact tracing, meaning trying to figure out everybody who you find is infected, who else have they been around for a significant amount of time. They brought it down to low single digits, and many, if not most, of the cases now are from international transmission. And they have a mechanism because there is still this sort of worrisome, because Wuhan is in the middle of the country. It's like the Chicago of China, although Chicago is actually not that far from Canada. Wuhan's not that close to any other country. Scattered outbreaks in Wuhan. So they went ahead and they actually tested 11 million people in a matter of weeks. And I think they only found a little over 100 asymptomatic cases, but then again, isolate, contact trace, retest people. So they've been able to bring it under control. So going back to the economics, what happened is in the first 3 months of this year, China's total output of goods and services, gross domestic product, fell, I think it was about 6.5%. So this is the biggest fall in Chinese economy on record. In the last 30 years, they've kept official record, and I'm pretty positive it is the biggest fall in GDP since some of perhaps the natural disaster in the early 60s, in like 50 years. So while we're going to exceed that, it was still a big shock to the Chinese economy. But because they basically crushed the virus, basically, because it's never 100%, they've been able to reopen a lot of the economy. They have made a lot of changes. Mask wearing is very common, but people I had a guy I know in China was sort of like needling me and others on Facebook, like, hey, guess what I'm going to do tonight? I'm going out to a pub, So we're like, yeah, that's cool. No, it is cool, but it's not like most of us could do that then. So the economy is growing again. Now there are challenges because a lot of people are still, there's a lot of concern over the virus in China. I think the government did a very good job of educating people about the dangers of the virus. It's not like here where we get, of course, to be polite, mixed signals from the White House. But there's everything. There's a double edge to that people are still not settled, not totally. Many people are not feeling totally secure, and that's in fact why the Chinese government decided to test 11 million people. It was really sort of a shock and awe approach to get people comfortable with going out again and reviving the economy. Because one of the things that China's done, which is actually very significant, is they've really expanded their whole service sector and domestic industries. While they're still a major exporter of goods and services to the world, it's a much smaller part of the economy. than even 10 years ago. And so they really need to get that back. But a number of industries, car sales, for example, have bounced back. People and kids are going back to school, etc. So it's going to be an ongoing struggle for China. For the first time, they haven't set a growth target when their National People's Congress met in terms of what they want to accomplish. In the past, they, for example, said, okay, we want to have a 6% rate of growth. So they've dropped that, although they have other economic targets which they feel still is important, which has to do with employment, has to do with poverty, but they're not so focused on just the production of goods and services. So this could actually be a good thing. And China, I mentioned, it is more, it has a much bigger domestic market, but it still has a major export market. And that's going to be a continued challenge to China, because a lot of their export markets are still mired in a recession or mired in a pandemic. So it's not sort of back to normal even there, although in some ways, in terms of individual lives, I think it is, but in terms of the overall economy, it's going to change also. I think I've run out of all the questions for now. And I guess to wrap up, I want to just thank the FRSO for organizing this. I hope you've enjoyed, or enjoyed is maybe not the right word, but learned something from this talk. I have been writing my basic strategy as I try and write an economic commentary, at least one a week. This week I did two, one on the unemployment insurance claims and then on the unemployment report. But I think most weeks I'll just be writing an article, usually on Thursday. It should come out. I'll be up on the web by Friday or Saturday to see how the progress of the economy is. Again, thanks for all of you who tuned in live. I can't see you, but I know you're out there, and I assume you can see me. And thanks to all of you who tune in afterwards, because I know there's a lot of protests going on today in the wake of George Foreman. And so we're in a very, even in my lifetime, because I grew up in the 60s, but in the 60s, there was, of course, the whole struggle, the African-American freedom struggle that inspired Asian Americans and Chicanos and women and queers to rise up. And then, of course, there was the war in Southeast Asia. There was a big struggle, but actually the economy was pretty good. I mean, in general, there was big inequalities, but it was pretty good. And now we have sort of the triple whammy of the recession, the pandemic, and of course the struggle against police crimes and the struggle to make Black Lives Matter. So I appreciate all of you taking your time out from that struggle, and I'll be back whenever I get invited. Thank you.